lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
En lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
En lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
En lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
En lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking to prosecute and extradite him when we were preparing his case, raises serious concerns about the prospect that he could have a fair trial in the United States.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
Now, what makes you think Julian Assange is going to get justice in the United States, in a court in East Virginia, where the jury is selected from a population where 85% are employed by CIA, NSA, DOD, or DOS, in a court where no one has ever been acquitted? We're thinking there's going to be a fair trial.
lugar de proteger a Julian Assange, se dedicaron en forma absolutamente ilegal, atentando contra el derecho a la privacidad, atentando contra los derechos humanos, a espiar a Julian Assange, cooptados por la CET.
The protection of legal privilege is an essential aspect of the right to a defence. The fact that we now know, as a result of criminal proceedings brought in Spain, that the company inside the Ecuadorian embassy was recording our private legal conversations with Julian Assange and handing them to the United States in the context of the United States seeking.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Free the Truth event. We're just about to start and people are trickling in, so we should be starting in a couple of minutes.
You should go ahead, Deepa.
Okay. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody, to this Free the Truth event. As many of you know, the Free the Truth event started last year in defense of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Our aim with the event originally was to have a forum for ordinary supporters as well as experts to come together to talk about some of the issues around the case. Julian Assange has been in Belmarsh maximum security prison for over a year now. It is astonishing that despite the various completely unethical, improper behaviors that have taken place during this case, he continues to languish in prison and the case against him continues to go on. He has been suffering psychological torture for about a decade now, and those of us on this panel are looking forward to discussing some of the ways in which the rule of law has been breached and how Julian's rights to a free trial have been undermined. And so I'm very glad to welcome to this panel Fidel Narvaez, former Ecuadorian Consul, Professor Mads Andenæs, former chair of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, Setephania Maurizi, journalist and the expert behind several freedom of information requests, which have shown a lot of light on this case. And shortly, Max Blumenthal will be joining us. Max has been doing some excellent investigative work in relation to how Julian was spied on within the Ecuadorian embassy. Max is having some technical difficulties joining, but he will be here shortly. At this point, I'd like to also acknowledge one of our long-term supporters at the Free the Truth events, Eva Jolie, who is unwell today and therefore unable to join. She was supposed to be on the panel. I'd like to also send a solidarity message to one of our long-standing and very well-loved experts, Craig Murray, who is going through quite a difficult time given the case being prosecuted against him in relation to contempt of court. All of us across the Free the Truth platforms and Don't Extradite Assange are very supportive of Craig and the excellent work he has done in relation to being our man in court, explaining to us what's really going on in relation to the Assange trial. Our solidarity as well to all the there were protesters and activists taking a stance against centuries of structural oppression and inequality, out on the streets now protesting in relation to the extraordinarily harsh police treatment and the killing of George Floyd. So our solidarity to all of you worldwide. Thank you very much to the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, which is the group of grassroots reporters in London who have been helping us run our events in the past, and to Don't Extradite Assange for broadcasting this event across 7 different channels. And special thanks to Juan Pasarelli and Jose for the fantastic work in putting this through. We also are broadcasting through Consortium News in Australia. Thanks, Kathy Vogan, for that. I'm joined on the panel also by my colleague and fellow expert, Professor Ian Munro, an expert on whistleblowing and a consumer of any book that is possibly available, and therefore a font of all knowledge. So welcome, Ian. And I'd like to start, Fidel, by asking you a question, if I may. And the first question is, could you give us a bit of background about how UC Global, which is the security firm, came to be involved with the Ecuadorian embassy and how they came to be guarding Julian? Could you tell us a little bit about all of that?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be with all of you. I joined my salutes to my friend Craig Murray. If he's watching us, he needs our support as well. He's being persecuted in between many things, probably because supporting Julian Assange. Anyway, when Ecuador decided to protect Julian in 2012, when we granted him asylum, the London embassy did not have any security company to protect the embassy. We didn't even have a security cameras system, no security guards, no anything. And it's understandable that somebody like Julian, staying 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for long term, needed protection. Him and the embassy as such. Let's remember that the embassy, for many years, from the very first day of Julian's asylum, became one of the most surveilled places on earth. British police displayed from first day outside the embassy for many years, police cars, police contingent there, with long-range microphones trying to listen what was happening inside our embassy, with special cameras distributed in surrounding buildings. Obviously, we needed protection. But Ecuador did not have its own security company, and it was problematic for us to send an Ecuadorian team to be based in the UK for different reasons. One of them, visa, but for different reasons. The Ecuadorian security bodies, the intelligence services, were historically penetrated, infiltrated by the Americans. Historically, when President Correa came into power, he tried to renew the whole intelligence services. It was a genuine effort. It was the right thing to do. In my personal opinion, probably it did not come out as we expected. That's a different issue. The point is that we did not have our own resources, human resources, to protect that embassy. And I understand that UC Global had already some contracts with the Ecuadorian government in Quito. Some of them protecting the the family of the president who were living in Europe. And I would understand that that company had the trust of the government, so they were giving the task to protect the embassy. And when I say protect the embassy, I mean not just Julian Assange, protect the embassy team, protect one of the most, as I said, surveilled places on Earth. I don't know how it was chosen to begin with. But as we know now, it was the wrong choice. It was the wrong choice, not just regarding the Ecuadorian embassy and Julian, regarding other issues that we know now that the company basically was unprofessional and corrupt as we have evidence right now. I will just add that Julian himself and many of us never trusted that company from day one. Never trusted that company. They always seem unprofessional. And the relationship with them was not the best with the security company. Yeah.
Thanks, Fidel. Setephania, I know you've talked in the past about your phones being searched and your personal details being looked into. Could you tell us your experience a little bit about what it was like going into the embassy for those of us in this call who are not able to know? And I'd also, just before we start, Setephania, I'd just like to welcome Max Blumenthal to the panel. We've introduced you already, Max, in your absence. And we're over to you, Setephania, if you could tell us a little bit about your experience of interactions with UC Global.
Sure. So first of all, you have to realize that when Julian took refuge in the embassy, the 19th of June 2012, I had already 3 years of experience in working, partnering as a media partner with WikiLeaks, because I had started working on the documents back in 2009 when few knew about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. So for me, it was pretty shocking to realize that throughout all these years, 11 years, I was able to meet Julian Assange as a free man just twice. And since last time was basically in September 2010. Since then, I always met Julian Assange confined initially under house arrest, then inside the embassy. So when he took refuge in the embassy back in 2012, I immediately started visiting him in the embassy. And the first time I met Julian in the embassy was November 2012. So at the very beginning. Initially, the atmosphere was quite friendly. I mean, there was no tension, there was no oppression, nothing. It was, of course, we were aware that we were under surveillance. We could see cameras, we could see police all around the world. And we were aware about this kind of heavy surveillance. But inside the embassy, there was no tension, no heavy atmosphere, but things changed. Things changed back at the end of, immediately after Correa left, immediately after Julian Assange published the documents about the US elections. And at that point, especially after Lenin Moreno went to power. At that point, going to the embassy was like to go to a prison. We were under heavy surveillance. I remember I could when visiting Julian Assange during the Lenin Moreno time, I was checking my phones and someone entered the room and said, you should not check your phones. And he sees my phones. He asked me for phones. So they were looking us in real time. And it was not just having the cameras doing surveillance. It was like to be there with the security, looking at you, listening at you. So when last year I got access to the UC Global files, I was really upset to see how they got access to everything. They got access to all my devices. They got access to my phones. They unscrewed my phones. And they did so in December 2017. And that was just 2 months after I had the Freedom of Information Act hearing, the hearing when we discovered that they had the UK authorities had destroyed the documents, crucial documents about the Julian Assange case. I remember I went to the embassy to discuss the Freedom of Information request, and in the embassy there was no one. It was end of December, 29 December 2017. There was just a security guard, and and I immediately realized that something wrong was going on, because as soon as I arrived, they seized my backpack and I protested. I said, no, I'm not supposed to give you my backpack because I have my notes, I have my devices. And they insisted, no, you should give us your backpack. And they said, no, I'm not in favor of this. And they said, yes, don't worry, no one will access your belongings. And now, 3 years later, I see those pictures. They spied on everything. They took pictures of my chargers. They unscrewed my phones. Probably they got access to notes. I don't know whether they got access to notes. I don't know whether they took copies of encrypted files in my USB sticks, because I had very important information. So I was really upset. And that was just, that was something, in a sense, I expected this heavy surveillance. In another sense, it is another matter when you see what they did in secret. Because no one told me, look, no one told me, look, we unscrew your phones. Look, we took pictures of your chargers. We took pictures of your power banks. No one, and they told me, don't worry, no one will touch your phones. No one will touch anything. And now we see this kind of heavy targeting of journalists, because they knew I was a journalist. Whenever I went to the embassy, they had my details. They knew I was going there as a journalist for my newspaper. At that time, I was working for La Repubblica, and they had my details. They had my passport. They knew for which newspaper I was working. And now what I want to understand is whether they got access to my encrypted files, because I had very important information. And many criticized me, why did you bring your encrypted files inside the embassy? But you know that as journalists, we have to travel with important information. So, I mean, it was 29 December 2017. How could I manage these files? Of course, I was traveling. I had important information. It was protected because it was encrypted. But now I wonder whether they got access to it, because I expect all sorts of things, considering that they unscrew my phones. So these tell you a lot what happens when journalists try to operate in a very hostile environment with security services and security companies trying to target you. And you do your best, of course, because you use encryption, you use all sorts of protections. At the same time, there is a big asymmetry between you and them. They have all sorts of resources. We don't.
I think you're right. I mean, I think there are a number of violations that we can see of basic trusts and basic standards that we expect. We are all expected to play by the rules, whereas they are not playing by any rules. And you can see that in relation to the CPS under the leadership of Keir Starmer, when they tried to stitch up Julian and keep his case in limbo for year after year by saying to the Swedish authorities, don't you dare get cold feet. This is not being treated like any other extradition. You can see it in relation to the way in which Julian is surveilled and how a sovereign embassy that we expect that the Ecuadorian embassy is a sovereign embassy and therefore will not be spied upon in that way is spied upon, things that you see in a spy book. And then also in relation to due process rights that Julian has been denied, even up to really petty things like not allowing him a radio, even though he's asked for one. So at every stage there have been intentional and willful breaches, not just of the law, but of basic expectations of trust between us and the state. And I'm sure you feel quite violated by that. And you've spoken quite passionately about how you feel that your privacy and the privacy of your sources and the people whose data you held in an encrypted way was violated. If I may, could I ask you to make a short intervention, just because it's so relevant at this point, because several private security firms have targeted Assange and WikiLeaks, including HP Gary and more recently UC Global. And I wondered if you could say a few words about this, and if Ian could thereafter say a few words as well. Setephania.
Yeah, so you have to realize that WikiLeaks was established in 2006, and 2 years later, it was already targeted by the US Army counterintelligence. And we know this thanks to WikiLeaks itself, because WikiLeaks published this document by the US Army counterintelligence, which had put WikiLeaks on its radar screen because of its publishing activities. So, that was at the very beginning, and it tells you a lot how hostile the intelligence services environment has been throughout the last 12 years, 11 years, and so on. So, I mean, here you have these intelligence services, which are tremendously powerful. They have all sorts of resources, economical resources, they have skills, they have technologies. On the other side, you have this small media organization, and there is no doubt that WikiLeaks is a media organization, because if you look at my freedom of information litigation, even the UK tribunals, the first-tier tribunals, finally acknowledge WikiLeaks as a media organization. So it's not my opinion. It's not something I'm telling you. It's the UK establishment, the UK tribunal, which acknowledge WikiLeaks as a media organization. And the reason why Julian Assange is in prison is because of his publication activities, not for other reasons, of course. So on the one hand, you have these powerful entities like the CIA and the US Army intelligence devising this plan. And the plan at the beginning was, let's target their sources, so that if we can target their sources, we destroy the trust. We know that the way we journalists operate is trying to gain trust of our sources. So the US Army counterintelligence plan was, let's destroy the trust of the sources who go to WikiLeaks to provide information. And that was the very first step at the very, very beginning in 2008, when WikiLeaks had been just established. But they never stopped this operation. So, for example, after publishing the US secret documents, the collateral murder, the Afghan war logs, and so on, we have a new kind of targeting. We had, for example, a kind of dirty war tricks by H.B. Gary, Palantir, which is a major company, private intelligence company, and Berico Technology. And here, in this case, they wanted to do a kind of dirty war against WikiLeaks, destroying the credibility, sending false information. Again, this is a very common way to target a media organization, because media organizations operate by trust and by credibility, reputation. So if we publish something false, if we publish fake information which is not genuine, our reputation is destroyed. And reputation is everything when it comes to the credibility of a media organization. So H.B. Gary plan, in which we discovered in February 2011, was about destroying WikiLeaks by destroying the reputation and by destroying basically the contacts with the journalists like Glenn Greenwald, who have been supportive from the very beginning, and other journalists. So these kind of plans, we see all these sorts of techniques and plans in order to target WikiLeaks. But let me tell you, Deepa, that one of the most disquieting things, in my opinion, is not just these kind of undercover activities, secret activities. For me, the most concerning things is what is done in open sight. So, for example, the US in investigation of WikiLeaks, they have put WikiLeaks under investigation from the very beginning, 2010, when they started publishing the Afghan war logs. Since then, WikiLeaks have been under investigation for 10 years, under continuous investigation for 10 years. And this investigation has been about national security. So they probably have used all sorts of serious targeting, interceptions, or whatever, because we know that whenever you have a national security investigation, you have huge power to investigate from all sorts of investigation power you have. So WikiLeaks has been under investigation for 10 years. If you ask me about a media organization which has been for continuous investigation, under continuous investigation for 10 years, I never heard of a single media organization which has been put under investigation for 10 years. So, I mean, this is something very serious, because as you can imagine, we can imagine that they have targeted all the WikiLeaks journalists, all their contacts, conversation with sources, whatever. So this is very serious. This is even more serious than undercover activities, because you expect undercover activities. Maybe I didn't expect UC Global undercover activities, but I did expect all sorts of undercover activities. But what I find very serious is the fact that they have been able to put under investigation for the last 10 years. And I don't know any media organization which was under the investigation for 10 years. I really don't know. In democracy, of course, you have this situation in authoritarian societies, but I never heard of a media organization in a democracy under investigation for 10 years.
Thanks, Stefania. Ian, could I ask you to tell us a little bit, maybe in a couple of minutes, because we're slightly running behind time, a little bit about the kind of intelligence agencies that were targeting WikiLeaks before UC Global came on the scene, and then we'll go on to talking to Max about what UC Global really did.
Thanks, Deepa. Well, I think Stefania certainly raised most of the points about the kinds of organizations that have been involved. And I think it's really, really interesting to look at the dynamics, because it's not simply WikiLeaks' journalists versus the US government, US intelligence organizations. It's a whole bunch of other organizations. So H.B. Gary, I believe, was hired by Bank of America when they became aware of the fact that their WikiLeaks was about to upload some potentially embarrassing emails and correspondence concerning the company. And H.B. Gary had said that they were going to discredit WikiLeaks, feed it misinformation, etc., as Setephania has described. And Anonymous then got involved and destroyed the reputation of H.B. Gary by counter-hacking H.B. Gary. Very strange set of dynamics. And WikiLeaks also, I think, have provided a vital service to journalism in being one of the few journalistic outlets who have informed the world about the role of these organizations as well, not just the banks and the politicians, but I believe it created a searchable database for another private intelligence organization hacking team, and which has been used by journalists and by academics to sort of get a better understanding of what's going on in this sort of very, very poorly understood world, essentially. But can I ask Max a question, please? Max, thanks very much for joining us in today's discussion about Julian Assange's situation. Your recent journalism concerning the role of UC Global is fascinating. To ask you, please, could you tell us some of what you found out and the funding organization UC Global and the political relationships that you've unearthed as well, please. Max is unmuted. Is not muted. Is muted. Sorry.
Max, we can't hear you yet.
Is Max not Mats, huh?
No, not Mats. Max Blumenthal. Thank you. Please bear with us a second while we restore Max's sound. Shall we come back to you in a second, Max, while we figure out what's happening to your sound? And could I just ask you, Mats, one of the things that, we'll come back to Max and talk specifically about what UC Global did within the embassy and the role of their security team, etc. But could you tell us what this means in the context of the rule of law, and particularly around attorney-client privilege and doctor-patient confidentiality, because the kinds of things that were spied upon were not just these journalists and the visitors, but also the private privileged conversations which would allow Julian to have a fair trial, and also the medical examinations that Julian underwent while he was in the embassy. And it is with great sadness that we have to say that Julian now has a long-term chronic lung condition because of the kinds of situation he went through in the embassy. He has a shoulder injury, which was untreated, even though they asked permission from the Foreign Office and others to leave the embassy to have the Ecuadorian Consul asked for permission to go to the hospital to get hospital treatment. He had a serious tooth condition, which had never been treated. And many of us know if you have a sore tooth, you can stay without the dentist for a couple of days. But in this case, he has stayed for years without treatment. And this is just absolutely atrocious.
No, I agree. Julian Assange's situation is special because you could list all of those ailments and problems. The fact is, it is now independently established, verified, for instance, by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and a number of other independent UN bodies, that Julian Assange has been subjected to psychological terror, to torture, psychological torture, over a number of years, and it is increasing, only increasing in...
Can everyone hear me now?
Is it?
I think you can hear me now.
Okay, but is that all right? I just continue my question.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to check my audio. Please go ahead.
We hear you extremely well. Thank you very much. So
great.
So we must just hope that he does not die as a consequence of the maltreatment he's subject to. But to the some of the other legal issues you brought up, the first thing is, of course, that he was staying in an embassy. All countries, except in a mutual relationship with one another, that embassies are to be protected. You're not supposed to intervene in these embassies. You're not supposed to mess up living conditions or anything there in a physical way. There are limitations on how you can have them under surveillance, etc. And the UK authorities' treatment of the Ecuadorian embassy was in clear violation of international law. In clear violation of international law. And the British diplomats who knew what went on are, of course, deeply embarrassed, because they do not want British embassies or diplomatic missions of different kinds, or British diplomats, to be subject to this kind of treatment. And then you can say, well, what did he have to do in the embassy, Julian Assange? And this embassy asylum is something which has been developed over a long period of time, and which, of course, British embassies and even more US embassies abroad, in China, the last 5 years, there's been several instances, have given protection to foreign nationals in embassies abroad. So what happens there, what has happened there, is something deeply shameful and in flagrant violation of international law. And if it is brought before any international tribunal, which it may in some context be, although, of course, the best instance to bring that before an international body would be the Ecuadorian state, which, for political reasons, may not want to do that now. Well, then, if it came before any international tribunal, and it could come up in the context of Julian Assange's rights as an individual before different UN bodies, for instance, well, then the UK would lose. And when we now got this information about the corruption relating this private contractor, it is clear that you are violating international law when you use this contractor in the way states have done in order to get illicitly information from the embassy and interfere in other ways with the life in the embassy and the activities of the embassy. Now, in addition to that, all countries have rules about lawyer-client privilege. You are supposed to be able to communicate with your lawyers. You can pay your advice to get legal advice. For instance, in the situation Julian Assange was. And in all countries, if you get to a court and you tell the court that actually they did listen into these confidential lawyer-client conversations, courts are tough. You know, national courts will not accept it. So one thing is the international law dimension, and then you have this national law dimension. And that applies, of course, also to the relationship to the doctor. That's supposed to be confidential. And we have in all national laws, and UK law is not any different from any other system there. You have very clear rules which limit the possibility for authorities to interfere, to go into the notes of doctors or to otherwise interfere in their communication with their patient. And then, of course, we need the press. Most of our countries say they believe in press freedom. And then we know there are people in the state who then violate that press freedom because they find that it doesn't apply to them. As you know, all rights, all rules, whether it's in international law or in domestic law, English law, Ecuadorian law, any legal system you like, there are people who feel that they are too important or their work is such that it shouldn't be curtailed or regulated or subject to law. And that's the way you formulated your question, wasn't it? The rule of law. And now many of the people who work in those services take this very seriously. Others do not. And some of them would say the rule of law, that's something which old men and very young idealists talk about. Yes, well, that may be so, but why do we have secret services? Why do we have intelligence services to defend our societies if they are really transforming our societies into, well, not law-abiding democracies, but systems where law and basic rights can be trampled upon? But so the point here is that when you deconstruct, now you probably will come back to the extradition case, of course, but that's one legal forum for bringing up these legal arguments. And that is a context where there will be a judge now at first instance, Court of Appeal, perhaps it'll end up in the Supreme Court, most likely will, whichever way it goes, where it is extremely difficult to neglect these acts and these violations. And it will come up, clearly will come up. So that's one forum.
And I will come back to you to ask you the questions, but Ian, you wanted to ask a question of Max. Please go ahead.
Hi again, Max. Yeah, could you just go into some of the details of what you've discovered and written about concerning exactly the role of UC Global and the political relationships that you unearthed? Thanks.
Thanks a lot, everyone, and thanks, Ian, for the question. I hope everyone can hear me okay now. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I published a lengthy investigation traversing the various relationships which apparently allowed the CIA under Mike Pompeo, who's now Secretary of State, to contract with UC Global through a third party, which was Las Vegas Sands. This is the company of Sheldon Adelson. And for those of you who might not know, and I'm sure there are only a few of you, if any, Sheldon Adelson is one of the most prolific donors to Donald Trump's political empire. He's also a benefactor of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and is essentially a representative of Netanyahu and the Israeli Likud party's interests in the United States. Adelson is a casino billionaire, one of the top 10 wealthiest people in the United States. And he has really two interests. Number one, expanding his financial empire, expanding his ability to have casinos in any country that will allow them. So Las Vegas and Macau in Chinese territory are his two main bases of operations. And number two, the number two on his agenda is allowing Israel to expand. It's thanks to Sheldon Adelson's money that we see the deal of the century come to fruition, which will put to bed the Palestinian national question with the annexation of Israeli settlements. Palestinians call it the steal of the century. And Jared Kushner, the presidential son-in-law, is close to Adelson. So it's unusual that Adelson would demonstrate an interest in someone like Julian Assange, who's not really associated with Palestinian advocacy. And what I think took place here was that Adelson was able to, for example, help the political career of Mike Pompeo, who is himself an ultra-Zionist, a Republican from Kansas. He's a Christian Zionist. Get him into the CIA and assist the national security state as he expands his financial empire. I drew a connection between Sheldon Adelson's work on behalf of the CIA and FBI in the past and what took place around the Ecuadorian embassy in London. It was actually an article reported first by The Guardian in 2015 relating to an operation that took place at Adelson's Las Vegas Sands in 2010 in Macau, where, according to a private intelligence report produced by gambling competitors of Adelson, the CIA was operating out of Las Vegas Sands, monitoring Chinese officials who were blowing lots of money on, at the card tables. They would approach these officials and seek to blackmail them into becoming informants, classic blackmail operation. So there seems to be a long-running relationship between the CIA and Adelson's operations. But in 2016, when Donald Trump became the presidential frontrunner, the relationship intensified, and it took place when David Morales, it began when David Morales, the CEO of UC Global, went to a security fair in Las Vegas to a convention center owned by Sheldon Adelson. Morales, was a small-time player. He only had the Ecuadorian embassy contract and the contract to guard the children of Rafael Correa. But he had someone very important, as we all know, inside the Ecuadorian embassy. So when he went to this security fair, he was approached, apparently, according to the documents that I obtained through this court case in Spain, by the executive vice president of Sheldon Adelson's security team. His name was Zohar Lahav. He is an Israeli American. And as soon as Morales returned from this fateful trip to Las Vegas, he began bragging to his employees back in southern Spain that we will from now on be playing in the first division, using a soccer metaphor, a football metaphor. That meant, according to Morales's business partner, that the Americans will find us contracts around the world. So what was this contract? The contract was technically to guard Sheldon Adelson's $70 million yacht, which is called the Queen Miri, named after Adelson's wife, Miriam. It's the most, I think, expensive yacht in the world. And so the funny thing about the contract was that Adelson already had a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week security team to guard his yacht, to guard his family. They followed him everywhere, and Lahav oversaw the whole thing. So why did he need David Morales? The reality appears to be that the CIA of Mike Pompeo needed cover for an operation which Setephania accurately described as a dirty war. And we know what took place around the Ecuadorian embassy. So it was basically Adelson's security team providing the cover, acting as a third party. And if you're familiar with the way the CIA or other intelligence agencies run black operations around the world, they often rely on friendly oligarchs or friendly billionaires to kind of give them the money up front, give them the cover. But this one was a little bit different because you had Zohar Lahav actually kind of running the operation on a day-to-day basis. I obtained phone logs from Morales's phone, text messages, emails that show him kind of in constant contact with Lahav. And I've subsequently acquired documents that show that they were very close friends. Then there's another figure. Deepa actually wanted me to emphasize this figure who's very, previously unknown, but very influential, who is the head of global security for Sheldon Adelson. His name is Brian Nagel. And it appears that Brian Nagel was involved in this operation to install the cameras in the Ecuadorian embassy that recorded not just video material, but sound as well, and to deceive the Ecuadorian security services, SENAIN, by setting up a separate server for those that Morales referred to as the American friends. So quickly, who is Brian Nagel? Aside from working for Sheldon Adelson, he was the assistant director of the U.S. Secret Service. The U.S. Secret Service is usually associated with, grim bodyguards who speak into their sleeves while they're wearing aviator glasses and guarding the president. But they don't just guard the president. They are the top cybersecurity agency in the U.S., and that is thanks to the work of Brian Nagel. After 9/11, starting in the late 90s, Nagel set up the agencies or the outfits that would bring at the FBI, U.S. intelligence services, private cyber experts, companies like H.B. Gary, for example, might have been involved to fight what they called cyber crime. Nagel was awarded by the CIA with a medal for his work in setting up these agencies. And these same agencies would have been on the front lines of the U.S. effort to take down WikiLeaks when it came online in 2010. Nagel retired in 2008 and went to work for Adelson. So he seemed like the perfect person to work hand in glove with Mike Pompeo's CIA to manage an operation like this. And so you heard Setephania talk about having her backpack searched, having her phone open. This happened to every journalist who visited. But this part of the operation, where you see Global posing as just the embassy security, would break into all of the sources, the phones and computers of all of the sources and journalists who came to visit Julian Assange, and particularly his lawyers. It really came to a head in December 2017. What was taking place in December 2017 was that Julian and his legal team were beginning to discuss a plan to allow him to exit the embassy under the Vienna Conventions to get him diplomatic immunity from a friendly country, a friendly third party. And this set off alarm bells back in Washington. Morales was instructed to start following everyone, not just in the embassy, but outside the embassy. And I'll get into that in a second. They were instructed to set up a separate feed on the cameras that would allow the Americans to see, and to get really aggressive with the guests, which Setephania experienced. So basically, Morales, and this is the part where the relationship with Sheldon Adelson really becomes clear. He was summoned at this time to Las Vegas Sands personally for a special session with the American friends. And on December 10th, David Morales sent a series of emails from a static IP address. I mean, I have these emails from Adelson's Venetian hotel to his spy team back at the embassy. And he said, first of all, he said, nobody can know about my trips, mainly my trips to the USA, because Senain, the Ecuadorian security service, is on to us. He was like, don't say anything about me being in Las Vegas to anyone around the embassy. And then he provided his spy team at the embassy with special instructions that came in the form of a PowerPoint presentation written in perfect English. Morales is a Spanish speaker. Although he speaks English as a second language, he could not have composed this. And the PowerPoint instructed his employees on how to create a login system so that the Ecuadorian security services would not notice that there was a second user with a separate security login. That separate user was obviously the CIA. And this was the this was the technology they wanted to use to spy on Julian as he was meeting with his lawyers to concoct this plan to legally exit the embassy. So it seems like there was only one person who would have been at Las Vegas, who was handing down personally with Morales in his physical presence these instructions. And to me, that kind of person was Brian Nagel. So just to kind of close here, I think it's important to just detail what happened in December 2017, because this was really kind of, I think, the end of one chapter where Julian could have actually left the embassy and this saga would have ended and he could have gotten diplomatic immunity with a country like Serbia or Bolivia, for example. But he didn't. And it was precisely because of this spying operation. So people who were visiting Julian were targeted. Even his friends, Pamela Anderson, the Canadian-American actress, was targeted and her Gmail password was stolen and her email was apparently invaded. We know what happened with Setephania and other journalists. Their phones were broken into. Stella Morris was targeted not just at the embassy, but outside the embassy. She was Julian's lawyer, but also as the mother of his 2 children. And apparently the US intelligence services were obsessed with this issue. And one of Morales's workers was ordered to steal a diaper from one of the infant children who were visiting Julian at the embassy with her, and to connect it to Julian through DNA. It was interesting because there were no instructions to obtain Julian's DNA, which meant they already had it somehow. But then they realized that you can't get DNA from feces. The worker approached Stella Morris outside the embassy and said, you know, this is insane what we're doing. I can't take it anymore. Just keep your child away from the embassy. And so there was clearly an indication that they were being spied on. Julian was using white noise to speak to his lawyers, so they UC Global put a magnetic microphone under the fire extinguisher. Julian would speak to his employees in the women's bathroom and turn on the water to try to counteract the spying mechanisms. And so they put a new camera in there. Everything was done. And then when the plan was finalized, the head of Ecuador's Senain Security Services visited the embassy to put in place the final parts of the plan. He too was spied on. His phones were opened. Everything that he said was recorded and sent back to the Americans, which is just it's an absurd crime. And Todd Chapman, who was the US ambassador to Ecuador, actually began threatening Ecuadorian officials not to carry out this plan. And those officials began to wonder, how do they know about this? Like, how do they know what's even taking place? I was told by someone who was intimately involved with this plan to allow Julian to leave the embassy, that an Ecuadorian official who was also involved in those plans, upon returning to Quito, was robbed at gunpoint in an official government car by 2 men on a motorcycle. They took nothing but his laptop, which contained details of the plan, and drove away. And this is not the only robbery attempt that took place in this whole operation. And so ultimately the plan was foiled. 2 days before the plan was supposed to be executed, in a court in Northern Virginia, just a few miles from where I'm sitting, US prosecutors introduced a secret indictment of Julian Assange as a direct result of this. So you can draw a direct line between the secret indictment of Assange and the spying of him at the embassy. I think I'll wrap it up here, but so many people who were around Julian at this time and around the embassy were targeted with criminal activity. And some of them are going to be filing criminal complaints or have filed criminal complaints in a Spanish court, including the employees of UC Global. That's how we know about all this. That's how I know about all this, was that the employees of David Morales ultimately concluded that they were not comfortable with what they had been ordered to do, that it was criminal. One of them called it treasonous and said we were working for the enemy, referring to the Americans. They went to Julian's lawyers. Julian's lawyers went to a Spanish judge. The Spanish judge enacted a operation to ultimately arrest Morales, and they've obtained all of these company backup emails, phone logs, and so on. And it's thanks to this Spanish case that we know Vicencio in Ecuador, who is just basically an agent of the Ecuadorian opposition. If you look at the reporting of CNN, you will see just straight up falsehoods, which claim that it was not the US spying on Julian Assange. It was actually the Ecuadorian government. And it was the Ecuadorian government that was upset. And they were claiming that, he was basically running this Russian hacking operation out of the embassy. So I think, there was a concurrent operation of misinformation and disinformation being run in order to provide cover and give interference to the Americans while they were waging their dirty war on Julian and his sources, lawyers, journalists, and friends. So this is really, I don't know if this is the misinformation that you're referring to, but if you read this article, it just explodes every other article that was, used to defame and attack Assange and attempt to link him to Russian hackers. And the main issue here is that UC Global's contract was technically, publicly, with Ecuador's Senain security services. They were given the contract because Senain officials could not easily travel back and forth into the Schengen zone, into Europe, to provide security themselves. But UC Global was an EU company based in southern Spain. They already had the contract with Correa's children, and so that's why they ultimately were approached by the CIA. But they were violating their contract with Ecuador and secretly working for the Americans via Sheldon Adelson. And none of the reporting up until this Spanish case, which was initiated in late 2019, none of the reporting acknowledges this. It's all false, and it all claims that all of these images that we see of Julian meeting his friends and everything that was learned was gathered by the Ecuadorians. It's just false. So that to me is the worst piece of misinformation. And now that, by the way, now that I've published this and laid it all out there for everyone to see, where's the mainstream media? Where is corporate media on this? I understand that they're privately very interested in this, but if you look on Twitter, no mainstream journalist dared to touch this story. None of them corrected the record. None of them updated their stories, which were previously false. And that to me is a separate scandal about how the media has treated the criminal operation run against Julian Assange, which is to simply more or less ignore it.
Thanks, Max. Fidel, could I invite you to make a few comments about this, because I could see you nodding your head and listening in intently. So over to you, Fidel.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepa. Well, listen, there are several crimes here that need to be accountable, obviously. We already knew that spying on private meetings with lawyers, with doctors, is illegal. It's a crime. Subtracting information from private telephones or computer devices is a crime. Handing over a political refugee to his persecutors is a crime.
That is the biggest crime, yes.
And when we are talking about the security guards, when we are talking about, even when we are talking about this Mr. Morales, we are talking we are talking about the small criminals. They are going to go to jail. That's not way out of it, because there's enough evidence that they were committing crimes all along, not just against Julian Assange, but against many people. The important thing about Max's investigation is that we are discovering, or we are getting to the bigger criminals, to the masters of this whole thing, which is not Mr. Adelson. Mr. Adelson is a medium-sized fish.
Yeah.
the bigger fish in this is Mr. Pompeo. Yeah. And is he going to be accountable for that? Well, I don't know. But the consequence of his activity is the danger precedent for not just an individual, Julian Assange, and the rest of his life in prison, but as a precedent for freedom of expression and for the journalists all over the world. That's the important thing. But the other reflection I want to say here, and that goes with Ian's question, is in order to carry over the persecution of Julian Assange, it was not only the spying, it's the defamation, the misinformation, yeah, which is done by also small fishes and big fishes. All this nonsense, complete rubbish about the insides of the embassy, about the supposed misbehavior of Julian Assange, about the supposed conflicts between the embassy staff and Julian Assange, and the discomfort of the Ecuadorian diplomats with Julian Assange, is only based in the reports of the complete corrupt UCL global company, which we know because their own employees who have come out and denounced the crimes and the spying against Julian recognize that they deliberately lie, exaggerate, misrepresent, and fabricated events and activities inside the embassy in order to kill Julian Assange's reputation. Behind all this is the concept of lawfare. Lawfare. And basically, lawfare has two sides. One of them is killing the reputation of the person. So it loses support. Why is that there's no more support for Julian? Because people believe what the big fishes, like The Guardian and CNN, but also BBC, have published about the embassy, about Julian, based on UC Global daily reports, which I know. I have the privilege, the personal experience to be there in that embassy for that many years, and I know exactly what happened there. And me and my colleagues, when some of these reports were leaked, we basically laughed because it's not true. It's absolutely not true. So people need to imagine how Julian, for so many years, will feel in such difficult conditions, physical conditions, no sunlight, no fresh air, no going anywhere, staying on his own for that long with only the security guards of UC Global, who he didn't trust, and he was right not to trust them, who were supposed to protect him, but instead of protecting him, now we know they were working for his persecutors.
Absolutely.
That's what we need to realize. And then to see your name published in mass media in middle of complete rubbish and misinformation, that's part of the psychological torture that the UN representative talks. And he's very right on that one, of course.
Thanks, Fidel. I think very rightly put, and thanks, of course, to Professor Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who has really taken this case and given it the profile and the coverage it deserves, and built on the work that Mads and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention have done. And also at this point, I just want to, when we think of what Stella and Julian and their families have gone through, Julian is not just a symbol of freedom of expression and a symbol of, Julian's case is not just about the rule of law. It's also about this individual. And in all of this, we mustn't forget that this individual, as you said, Fidel, has been put through huge amounts of psychological torture. I'd like to draw everybody's attention to the work of doctors for Assange, who have published some very important letters, including a very long letter in the Lancet. I'd also like to draw people's attention to an interview that a long-term supporter of Julian Assange and one of the few MPs who had the courage to speak about Julian Assange in Parliament, Chris Williamson, has done with Matt Kennard last week, in which Chris talks to Matt about the role of a certain Labour leader of the opposition. I'd also like to send solidarity to Julian and his family, and to those in the Nordic states who are running a campaign to hold Marianne Ny to account for the way in which the Swedish prosecutors played around with the rule of law, essentially, along with Paul Close within the CPS, which was then under the leadership of Sir Keir Starmer. Could I just ask a quick question of you, Max, before I go to Mats, because I've been wanting to ask Mats a particular question about the extradition. But before that, Max, is Max? I cannot see Max. There is a problem. But maybe I will come back to Max in a second.
You catch him when he gets back to the room.
Indeed. Mads, could you tell us, one of the things that it's very difficult to understand, and for ordinary people, and there are a number of people in this audience who are legal experts, but there are also a number of people who don't understand how, and as somebody who attended the courts, I cannot understand how the legal process can be subverted in this way. Could you tell us a little bit about the extradition process, and in particular in relation to the burden of proof within the extradition process, which my understanding is it's lower than that in a civil case. So could you tell us what threshold the CPS have to reach in respect of the US, and why this case, in your opinion, hasn't yet been thrown out of court, other than, of course, because yes, we can go to the Supreme Court and we can go to the High Court, and hopefully they will uphold the rule of law.
Yes.
But
so basically, it's all about jurisdiction to begin with, so that the criminal jurisdiction only applies to your own country. UK criminal jurisdiction to the UK, the territory of the UK, or the waters around. And then you understand that you can't, for instance, prosecute for offences committed abroad, or you want to assist other countries prosecuting offences, for instance, when the person they suspect turn up in your country. So then in the international law system, where countries agree to give one another advantages on a mutual basis, you then have these treaties or conventions on extradition. And the US and the UK have an extradition treaty, and the main test is reasonable suspicion. The UK courts only have to look at something which is not convicting him. It's a very, very low threshold, reasonable suspicion. And then you must have the information necessary to establish that there is a reasonable suspicion. Then there are some exceptions. Generally, if there's a political offense or an offense you don't at all accept in your own system, you would disregard or not apply this extradition agreement in the European Union. As you remember, in the UK case, we have the European arrest warrant, which is supposed, because of the mutual trust we have between European countries in the EU, there should be a very automatic procedure, very little holding back. In the US, the decision was, are we going to pursue Assange on the basis of this assisting to a breach of confidentiality by assisting somebody in getting into the information database? You know, that was then considered a particular offence which could be suitable to demand, request an extradition of Mr. Assange. And then, of course, they said, don't care. We go for the big one. We prosecute him for espionage and whatever else. Well, that is making it extremely difficult for the UK courts to extradite. Now, it's so politically focused that one really has to worry about that process. But so that's one aspect. Another aspect of territory and the limitations you have in the law that is so basically territorial. That's one of the reasons why a US security service, for instance, will ask a private contractor in a third country to be involved when they provide their services in a fourth country. You know, you create all these barriers, which makes it very difficult to actually hold anybody liable afterwards. And the limitations of the law there are many, but in addition to that, when it comes to the criminal law, in most countries, although we have independent authorities, they are influenced by political wishes, and that creates, in Assange's case, a great problem. And really, it is countries like Spain which happens to have a certain institutional system for independent prosecution. Which then, you remember in the Pinochet case in the 1990s, was very important. You had a judge who's now also involved in this case, who then very heroically stood up and started an investigation, which meant that Pinochet was kept for a long period in some kind of pre-trial or pre-extradition detention in the UK. Now, again, we have to rely on other systems to do this. In the UK, however, I just mentioned one case as my last point here, is in 2017, you got the decision in the Belhaj case, where Jack Straw, who had been the Secretary of State, Foreign Affairs, he was sued by Mr. Belhaj because he was kidnapped with his wife in the Far East, brought to Libya, which the US and the UK at that stage collaborated with, tortured, mistreated, kept for several years. In the end, he was let out, and by chance, some information became available to the press. The case started, and the UK courts then faced the government saying, well, basically, you can't sue the Secretary of the State or the Deputy Director of MI6, the UK intelligence services. You can't sue them for this. They have all kinds of immunities, and in the end they come up with a very contorted idea that it would affect the collaboration between the UK and the US, something they refer to as foreign act of state doctrine, which then the court limited. So actually, Mr. Belhaj was allowed to then sue the UK government, which then meant that he got a large sum of money, and the case was out of the court system. But in that process, we got a lot of information, and it is dishonoring, for that. It was a deputy head of the MI6 at the time, and then Jack Straw. It is dishonoring, and it has effects, although they did not end up in prison the way they should have done. I intervened as a UN Special Rapporteur with on behalf of some of the others, together with the then torture reporter in the UK Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, and we then course, explained what the international law said. So that's just one case which has then brought some kind of result. It means that the people who are involved here, we have a number of issues. First of all, Mr. Assange must not die in custody. He must not be extradited. Then we have all these other issues which play into that. But also, it's a long-term obligation on civil society to not give up. To make sure that these people are prosecuted. The next 5 years, in the next 10 years. Basically until they die, they will face this possible retribution by society in the sense that they are held to account the way the law requires. And that's also something we have to build up in parallel. But of course, first things first, make sure he doesn't die and that he's not sent to the US.
Yes. Thank you, Mads. Could I draw people's attention to the fact that Julian will be under special administrative measures if he goes to the US, in that neither his lawyers nor he will be able to express clearly, and we'll come back to that in a second in terms of the complete violations of Julian's human rights if he were to go to the US. But I know Max Blumenthal has to leave in a short while because he has to catch a train somewhere else. Could I just ask you a couple of questions, Max, before you leave? One, I think you've referred to in the past about the fact that there was attempts to kidnap and poison Julian. Could you say a few words about that, please? Max, you need to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Can you hear me now? Good. Okay. This Zoom is there's a ghost in the machine. In any case, I blame the MI6. In any case, to your question, this was another disturbing detail that came out of the Spanish case, which is, that according to UC Global, according to a testimony by a protected witness, who I believe was the former business partner of David Morales, who quit the business because they were disgusted with what was taking place around the embassy, a plan was put forward to either enable the kidnapping of Julian Assange. I think this was in early 2018, by leaving the door of the embassy open and then allowing a kidnap team to enter, and poisoning him was also a proposal put forward. And this led to, a really vehement protest by UC Global employees, including those who were the spies at the embassy. And they said, Morales, you're taking us down a really dangerous path here. This is, not what we signed up for. But everything that UC Global did in every capacity was just following orders. They were just taking instructions. And there's an important detail in my piece where the former business partner describes his confrontations with David Morales and says, what you're doing is working for the enemy. This is illegal and so on. You're violating our contract with the Ecuadorian government. And Morales would rip open his shirt sometimes and puff out his chest and declare, I am a wholehearted mercenary. So a wholehearted mercenary would not really have any ideological conviction to take down WikiLeaks or Assange. He's just following orders. My point here is that if there's an assassination plan put forward or a kidnapping plan put forward, we should expect that it's being put forward by Washington, or more specifically by Langley, by the CIA. So yeah, I should have mentioned those details earlier. There were a few more questions in the chat I wanted to address. One is that we should interview Fidel Narvaez, and I want to point viewers to an article that Fidel contributed to us at the Grayzone, thegrayzone.com, after Julian Assange was smeared in April 2019 after coming out of the embassy by the new embassy staff put in by Lenin Moreno, the kind of neoliberal leader who is following the dictates of Washington and the IMF. And they said that he smeared feces on the walls and abused embassy staff. It's just classic CIA disinformation, and Fidel did a great job of taking down that misinformation. So I point everyone to that article. It's a good piece to share if you're ever confronted with this misinformation, and I think there's definitely room for it. I think he's someone that I think other voices in the U.S. should hear from more. Those who have been sympathetic to Julian. It's really hard right now to actually get the media to pay attention to this.
On
and
that point,
this
Max, sorry, on that point, could I just ask, I know Setephania also will have to leave shortly, so could I just ask you very quickly, if you will, in 2 minutes, if you could tell us, what do you think of statements more recently that what the US government did in respect of UC Global is justified? And same question to you, Setephania. Over to you, Max.
Well, I'm not aware of, are there any US government statements justifying it?
No, there are some journalists who have come out to say that the US government's role and what UC Global has done is justified. And many of these journalists obviously are stenographers of the state. So it would be very interesting to see. I can see you're horrified by that very statement. Do you have an immediate response to that?
But it's absolutely true. It is beyond belief and unacceptable, but they say it.
Which journalists have said that?
Setephania, did you want to go? Sorry, I heard you start to speak.
I haven't heard about journalists justifying and saying that basically what they did is acceptable. What is surprising to me is that this silence and lack of coverage. If you consider the Washington Post, they had one of the prominent journalists there, and Ellen Nakashima, national security reporter. And as far as I know, they didn't react. They didn't run a major story. There was no protest. And, I feel lucky because my union, the Italian Union of Journalists, issued a protest, at least a public protest, but others were completely silenced. And to this day, we haven't any kind of coverage. I mean, can you imagine if we had this kind of situation for the New York Times or the Guardian? Imagine if the editor-in-chief of the New York Times or the Guardian had been targeted by such a security company spying on all his meetings and visitors and doctors and lawyers. It would be an international scandal and outrage and hundreds of articles, and we don't see anything about Julian Assange WikiLeaks, which is a complete scandal. I mean, if you go through the UC Global emails by David Morales to his employees, he provides instructions, he gives instructions to his employees, asking to gather information and about Stella Morris, about the Juan and Jose Passarelli, about Sarah Harrison, about all the lawyers like Baltasar Garzón, about Renata Avila and Jennifer Robinson, the Ecuadorian lawyer Carlos Poveda. So, I mean, this is something extremely serious, and you can imagine what we would have seen if this was about the New York Times and the traditional media. But since it was about WikiLeaks, we see this silence. We don't see any kind of public condemnation. As I said, I was lucky because my union protested, by others did absolutely nothing. And I'm sure the journalists involved and targeted, few of them will file criminal complaints, will ask for condemnation, public statement from the unions. So, I mean, this silence is really of concern,
Yeah, I actually have I have the images of Ellen Nakashima, the Washington Post correspondent's phone, that were taken by UC Global as they opened it and took all of the information they would need to hack into her phone. I have images of Anthony Lowell Bergman, who was the New York Times correspondent, being spied on inside the embassy. And we hear complete silence from these media institutions about this taking place. As Setephania said, if Vladimir Putin and his intelligence agencies were behind this, it would be a gigantic international scandal. It's really remarkable how the US media, which poses as independent, the Washington Post says on its banner, democracy dies in darkness, is so willing on an almost individual level to shroud this case in darkness. It almost makes you question whether it's real, because it's so scandalous, it's so criminal, and they won't touch it. I'll provide one more detail before I go that relates to something Setephania mentioned, which was that Baltasar Garzón, who was the head of Julian Assange's legal team, was followed by UC Global spies when he went to pick up the former Ecuadorian president, Rafael Correa, at Barajas Airport in Madrid, Spain. I actually have a intelligence report that was apparently personally written by David Morales in English on following them. And why was it written in English? I mean, he wasn't writing this for the Ecuadorians. It's obvious he was writing it for American intelligence. They were photographed inside Garzón's home. You know, this was taking place outside the embassy, targeting former world leaders and the lead lawyer for a publisher who had not been convicted of any crime at that point. And according to a former UC Global employee, in November 2017, again, remember, Morales is just following orders here. He proposed breaking into the Madrid office of Baltasar Garzón in order to, in the words of the employee, obtain relevant information about Mr. Assange and give it to the Americans. Okay, this is November 2017. December 18th, 2017, El País, the Spanish daily, reported that 3 hooded men dressed in black broke into Garzón's office, took no money, but according to the paper, shuffled through documents. So put 2 and 2 together here. This is a global criminal ring, pretty obviously being run by the CIA against lawyers, against journalists, completely subverting freedom of speech around the world, attorney-client privilege, all to destroy a publisher who embarrassed them. And once again, American media is allowing whatever's left of democracy to die in darkness.
Thanks, Max. We have a question from Joe Lauria at Consortium News, who asks, how did the Americans get Ecuador to cancel the immunity plan? And do you have any details, Max? So last question for you before you and Setephania have to head off. I'm hoping Setephania will stay for a few minutes longer if she can.
Thanks, and thanks to Joe for everything Consortium News is doing on this issue. Well, as I said before, basically the spying on the embassy and Julian and his legal team enabled the U.S. to foil the plan to get Julian diplomatic immunity so he could leave the embassy under the auspices of the Vienna Conventions. This was a secret plan. It required total secrecy. It appears, based on what I know about the plan, that Julian was just going to get in a car awaiting diplomatic vehicle one day, and he was going to be out of there. And if anyone wanted to arrest him, they would have to completely violate the sanctity of diplomatic immunity and sovereignty, and it would have created a massive international incident. It would have been, tantamount to an act of war. And so the secrecy of the plan was completely disrupted. Therefore, if Julian had stepped foot outside the embassy, he could have just been arrested then. So that's what I think took place. And as I mentioned, Todd Chapman, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador, was actually threatening Ecuadorian officials about the plan.
Revoking the immunity in relation to allowing the British to enter the embassy.
Well, this was political as well. I mean, this is almost unprecedented, and we have to recognize we've done a ton of reporting on what's taking place in Ecuador at the Grayzone. Lenin Moreno, who was the successor to Rafael Correa, and I know Fidel can probably speak with more authority about this, was basically what Correa correctly called a Trojan horse for the US and the IMF. He had an IMF loan being dangled before him that the US controlled, and he was being told, give up Assange. And what he has subsequently done since coming in is arrest Jorge Glass, the former vice president of Correa, sentenced Correa in absentia to 8 years, basically targeting all of his political enemies who also happened to be people the US was targeting. And on the same day that Julian Assange was arrested, April 11th, Ola Bini, a friend of Julian Assange, was arrested by Moreno's security services inside Ecuador and denied any due process for weeks and weeks. So basically, you had someone come into in Ecuador who was a vassal of Washington, who willingly allowed the sovereignty of his country to be violated by a foreign police force, the British police, which were itself controlled basically by the US Department of Justice. If you scroll to the end of my piece, you'll see photographs taken inside the courtroom during the first round of hearings on Julian's extradition. And someone who was inside the court provided me with photos of Americans in the courtroom who were seated behind the British prosecutors, basically whispering instructions into their ears, who appeared to be US Department of Justice employees. So the US is running this whole case. The whole thing is run by US intelligence, as far as I can tell. And that means Lenin Moreno's government as well.
Thanks, Max.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Stephania, one of the comments we've always seen is that the reason the mainstream media is so silent is because when the government draws the line, they are not anywhere near the line, and they are happy to move back. And of course, except for a few exceptional journalists like Peter Oborn and others, and John Pilger, for example, there aren't very many journalists who have commented in the way you have done or others have done. Could you say a little bit, if you have any thoughts on why the alternative media, which, whether they are revealing environmental crimes or whether they're really revealing crimes in relation to other kind of criminality against women, against children, etc., they should also be afraid, because if not the mainstream media, at least they should be afraid about the government setting these boundaries. Do you have any thoughts about why the alternative media is silent?
Well, I'm not sure, because I can tell you my experience in this case. From the very beginning, this case has been, has been very weird, because we knew from the very beginning that Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists were obvious targets, and we knew that they were targeted by all sorts of legal and extra-legal procedures. At the same time, even if this was very clear from the very beginning, there was little public outrage. There was a little public reaction, public debate on this. So, and of course, then the demonization campaign of Julian Assange made the rest, because one of the reasons why Julian Assange there is very little solidarity is due to the demonization campaign against Julian Assange. But why the alternative media, why the other media don't work on this case, I really don't know. It's I don't know. I realize that there is very little journalism. If you consider, for example, my freedom of information litigation, I decided to go for it because back in 2015, no one had done it. So no journalist had tried to get the documents about this case, which was unbelievable. It was so high profile, and dozens of articles about the most absurd things but no one had tried to get the documents, not even the so-called independent media, which is quite unbelievable, because you expect the mainstream media not going for it, but you expect the so-called independent media get the documents, not even them. So I mean, it's very depressing, and that's why I insist with this Freedom of Information Act litigation, because I feel the duty. I mean, a man has been in prison, has lost his freedom immediately as he published documents revealing war crimes, and he has spent 10 years confined, initially under house arrest, then in the embassy, then now in a prison, and no one tried to get the facts about this case, and I cannot accept this. That's why I insist and go ahead with this Freedom of Information Act litigation, because I feel the duty. I absolutely feel the duty. I mean, I cannot accept that in the heart of Europe, you have this situation about a major publisher who was an obvious target for revealing war crimes and torture, and no journalists get the facts about this case, and no independent media.
But could I ask you, Setephania, just the thing that we expect the press to be critical, stand up to government, etc. But of course, you know, and I know, that most journalists have an idea of press freedom. That's good. But also, most of them support government.
Yeah, absolutely.
One. Two, the people who devised the strategies here, who's devised all these clever breaches of decency and law, which we've been discussing, they, of course, also devise very sophisticated strategies for the publicity, you know, like blackening Julian Assange's name, his character, his moral, etc., in a way which makes it very difficult for people in the mainstream at certain points in time, you know, so they turn against him. They've used this. It's not like these people who are looking at this from the other side, who work for the intelligence agencies, etc., that they just do the things that Max Blumenthal told us about. They do these other things as well. They have operation desks. They use a lot of energy, a lot of money on this. And of course, they are very good at influencing public opinion.
Absolutely.
And here, it's not like it's one US agencies, it's a raft of US agencies who use all their contacts. And in the UK, and for that matter in Sweden, in Scandinavia, in Sweden, I'm sure in Norway too, there are people who would spend an inordinate amount of time and all their competence and all their resources on achieving the results we see today. So in a sense, you know, it's for us not to be naive. It's a huge power, you know, over mighty power with endless resources on the other end. And it's for us to do, you know, the things you do, you know, particularly the things you do, and make other colleagues, you know, lawyers like me, journalists like you, feel bad conscience, you know. How can they let this pass the way they do? Unacceptably, morally, professionally, legally, and on all these different levels.
Yeah,
I mean,
sorry, go on, Setephania.
You realize that these people, the CIA, the intelligence agencies, have protection at all sorts of protection at every level, even at the media level, because otherwise there would be a lot of public outrage and whatever. They got protection even at the media level. So, I mean, I can imagine this kind of influence operation, this kind of demonization campaign, heavily supported by these intelligence agencies and well-funded. Whereas if you look at on our side, if you look at, I'm a journalist working completely alone on this Freedom of Information litigation, struggling to get money to pay legal bills. So the asymmetry is huge. You know, on the other side, you have intelligence agency, the CIA, the US government, and many other entities with all sorts of resources and strategies. And on the other side, you have the list of people, you know.
And before people feel very depressed, I think one of the, I think there is also a sense that we are all here together today, in a sense, trying to change that. And hopefully each of us has influence and some agency in order to be able to transform this, and so many skills. And I noticed a comment from one of the lawyers in the audience who says that this is a state-sponsored abduction, and it is an irregular rendition of Julian Assange, and that we have to remember that when we talk about it. We've gone over our 1.5 hours, which we had allocated, but it's been a very interesting debate. I know there are those whose questions have been posted, whom hopefully some aspects of your questions have been answered by the speakers. But thank you to everybody who attended. I'd like to thank Don't Extradite Assange for organizing the Zoom, the platform, the discussion across platforms. I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much for your contributions, and my co-host, Professor Ian Munro. I'm Deepa Govindarajan Driver, and if you would like to contact me to the Eventbrite or at Deepa_Driver if you want to have any further comments about this. The hashtag we're using for today is #FreeTheTruth. So please feel free to use that hashtag as you tweet about the event afterwards. And thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.